Okay, thank you so much for giving me time to try to give some comments to what we have heard, and of course I will try to add a little bit to it based on the work we are currently doing. All you know the issues that we are facing and how we are facing a new reality in terms of prices, which could be good and bad. It's something to analyze and to look into detail. But the major concern we have been looking at is basically how it affects consumers and producers, and how we can measure the different elements behind the composition of all the changes. And the three panelists have gone through different dimensions of it, which I will try to bring together in a conceptual framework we are working. So in the last presentation, we looked more at the domestic market and domestic demand and supply, and how they interrelate, and also including even the M2 and increase in money in the market, which of course will put pressure over the demand. But we will also have significant discussion on how the country will protect itself to avoid this transfer of volatility. So to be able to argue that there is a transfer of volatility from international to local markets, we need to take into account all the different measures put in place by the country to be able to minimize that transmission effect. So it's not an easy job, it's a very complex job. And it's something that we cannot easily look by just looking to international prices and looking to the relationship with local prices. Also, there was a discussion in terms of the input markets, which come through the input prices and which come through oil prices, and Xiabo, or Suling through Xiabo, tried to bring this up, and I think was a traditional way through which we were looking at the effect of oil prices over food commodities. But things have changed and have become more complex and interesting nowadays. And that is a little bit linked to the issues of policies being put by countries, which will affect in a different way the competition for land and water. And that's what we have seen in terms of the biofuel policies, and also in terms of environmental policies that was mentioned by Catherine, and how that can also put pressure over the land and the price of land, of course, and that could also affect international prices through water management or through different practices, as the conservational practices that she was talking. And finally, what was mentioned by Kim, which is more on the trade liberalization and what we call secondary policies that help to exacerbate the effect. And he showed some results on how the price spikes were exacerbated because of the trade liberalization. And one of the additional points that I want to bring around it is not only increasing price levels, but also could be increasing in price volatility. So I won't bore you with this diagram, but basically this shows the evolution of prices since 1990 on the basic commodities and crude oil, and these are levels in real terms. But the only thing I want to mention is if we look historically and we look to the level of prices historically, this is for example of corn, clearly we are not in 2007, and even if I go farther to 2010, we are not in the highest levels in real terms historically. So in terms of price spikes, we are in spikes, but those spikes are not historically the highest ever. So it's important to mention that we have been facing worse periods in the past. Now, the problem is, are we facing the same situation in volatility? And that's where we have been spending a lot of time in IFPRI to look at volatility and trying to measure in the best way possible volatility. There is a lot of misinterpretation of what is volatility and confusion with level of prices. So together with my colleague Carlos Filo and Zhao, we developed a non-parametric model that tried to measure these periods of volatility, and not only that, but we try to define consistently periods of excessive volatility. Now, if we do that, which is kind of a complex model, we come up with this graph, and this is just an example of wheat. And the only thing I want to explain you, the green lines, or these messy green lines, are the real changes in returns of the wheat price, future wheat price. The orange line is the 95 percentile, so the extreme value we want to model. So that's a result of our model. So whenever the green line crosses the orange line, that means that we are in a 5% probability that event, that change in return, will occur. So it's a very rare event, what we call in extreme theory is an extreme value. And with that, and how many times we violate this level of 95 percentile, we can define periods of excessive volatility. So the red shades are showing those periods where we face a statistically significant excessive volatility in windows of 60 days. If I look historically, what we are facing today, before 2007, we had 35 periods per year in average of excessive volatility. Since 2007 to today, we are in 85 periods in average of excessive volatility. So historically, we are facing higher volatility or higher frequency of periods of excessive volatility that we faced in the past. So historically, in difference to the price levels, we are in periods of more volatility than we have faced in the past. Now, how is this linked to the reasons behind and to what we have heard before? The first thing is that we have low stocks. And this graph is basically showing the ratio of grain stocks to use. And we put China in and China out because we don't have good information on China. And that's the whole discussion through the G20 and the development of the AMIS initiative. So when you have very low levels of global stocks, then you have less capacity to manage that price volatility event. So that's a fact, and that's something that we need to live with it. But one of the major concerns is the level of concentration of commodities and how very few countries are concentrating most of the exports. So whatever happens in the top 4 commodities, in the top 4 countries exporting countries, will affect immediately the prices. And this is the case of maize, where 84% is managed by 4 countries, basically, being the US the first. In wheat, 63%. Rice is even worse, and if we include millet rice, is even 85%. So the concentration of my world portfolio is pretty high. So whatever happens in any of these countries will automatically reflect in an increase in prices, and of course in the case of volatility. The second issue, which is a policy response, or a policy issue, is the issue of biofuels, which is similar to the issue that Catherine was mentioning in terms of conservation. So the US decided to make a policy of subsidies and a policy of fixed mandates to promote biofuels. And that's okay. You can make your own policy as a country. And biofuels is not wrong by itself. Production of biofuels creates jobs and creates access to farmers to sell their products. The problem here is that at the same time, if you look at the share, which is the orange line, has significantly increased to a significant level, to 35% of what was the production of maize in the case of the US. But if you add to this the share that I was explaining before, that the US by itself concentrates 53% of the global exports of maize, then that policy design developed in the US immediately has an effect over global prices and the global market. And that's something that we need to be concerned, especially if you are one of the major exporting countries in the world. So that's something to look at it, and we need to find ways to resolve that. So the problem is not biofuels by itself, the problem is the policies used to promote biofuels and how much that is creating a distortion at the global market. The second issue, and this is work from EPTD and Jerry's Nelson team, is basically what is the effect in terms of the different scenarios of climate change. And again, this is linked to the concentration on the market, in the sense that for each of the different scenarios, the dark green lines will show the different scenarios of economic growth, where you have an optimistic or pessimistic based on the population growth and the income growth. When we average, or when they average the changes in climate, it will affect, of course, the prices of the different commodities, ranging from very big proportions to even higher in the case of the pessimistic scenario of rice, which is the most concentrated commodity in the world. Now, add to that, it's very linked to the comment of Su Ling through Xiao, in the sense that there is also an increase in the velocity of circulation of financial monetization of the commodities, and that's go through the futures market in the case of the global markets. So what we are facing there is that there is a lot of more transactions going on in the futures markets, which increase the velocity, as in the case of M2, if I increase the velocity in the central bank, I will create inflation. Now, if we look at the volumes, they have increased substantially from 2,300% between 2003 and 2008 alone in transactions in the future markets through index funds. And only 2% of those transactions get realized in physical commodity. So basically, I am using the same physical commodity and moving significantly around, which could put some pressure over prices. And not necessarily we can talk here of a speculation or no speculation. Basically, we are talking of an increase in the velocity and, of course, some pressure that could end in inflation. Linked to what Kim was saying in terms of the secondary policies, and this is very important, and it's what countries will do to protect themselves, because if a country is facing a global price increase, they want to protect their local consumers. But these policy responses could be very, very complex, especially if you are a big exporting country or you are a big importing country by reducing import tariffs. And exactly what Kim was saying is David Laborde and Antoine Bouet simulate the effects of this natural shock, which is an exogenous demand increase, the red shade here, and what will be the policy effects of these policies being put in place by an important exporting country. So the yellow is showing the effects of increasing export taxes to mitigate the shock of domestic prices. The light blue is the effect of decreasing import duties to mitigate the shocks on domestic prices, what China will do, for example. And the light blue is basically the interaction effects between import and export restrictions. So look how the effect is being exacerbated, as Kim was explaining, because of these policies being put by the countries. And if we separate them by a net importing country and an exporting country like Argentina, you will see the effects over the income. And again, for Argentina, the way they did it in terms of putting more taxes to exports, they increased their revenue and of course they increased their income, but that exacerbated the effect over prices. And in the case of Egypt, of course, it was a negative shock because they had to pay higher prices because of the policies being put in the country of Argentina. So this brings us up to the importance of the effect of policies over global decisions, and especially when you have such concentrated markets. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Maximo.